So good evening and welcome. My name is Kevin McGarry. I'm the Associate Director for Public Engagement at the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation. As most of you know, the Trust's mission is to steward the past and present of the Presidio neighborhood and to inspire preservation advocacy throughout the county in order to create a more vibrant community, both the city of Santa Barbara, the county of Santa Barbara, and really our community as Californians. I'd like to introduce our guest, our very special guest this evening, Dr. John W.I. Lee. He is an associate professor up at UCSB in the Department of History. And he has recently published a book. Most of you probably read the description, but I'll read it for you here just to give a little insight to what John will be sharing with us. Born into slavery in rural Georgia, John Wesley Gilbert went on to achieve national renown as a scholar, educator, community leader, and Christian missionary. Our guest this evening, Professor John Lee of UC Santa Barbara, will talk about his new biography recently published by Oxford University Press, including a discussion of Gilbert's California connections. And when I was speaking with John just before we started the webinar, he was telling me that he's added some things that he thought would be specifically of interest to our community here at the Trust. So I'd like to thank him for that. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over so John can start his presentation. You will have an opportunity to ask questions. I ask that you do that using the Q&A function. It's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, usually on the center left side of your Zoom screen. There's a Q&A function, or you can also use the chat box, and I'll be collecting questions. We won't get to all of the questions, I don't think, but I'll be selecting some for Dr. Lee to answer at the end of his presentation. So welcome, Dr. Lee. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's really wonderful to be here. I hope my sound quality is good for everybody. If there's a technical difficulty during the talk, please put it in the chat so that we can see it and can fix it right away. I also want to thank Ann Peterson for making the connection. It was such a long time ago that I first came to UCSB to do my job talk at Santa Barbara, and Ann was one of the first people I met at that time. And I also spoke, I think, in Monica Orozco's History 4A class. It was a long time ago. So I'm just really pleased to be here to tell you a bit about my book and the story of John Wesley Gilbert. And it's a story actually for a group that's interested in historic preservation that begins with the destruction. On August the 3rd, 1968, the main building of Payne College in Augusta, Georgia, burned down tragically. And you can see the photograph of the left of the fire, and at the right you can see the photo of the building Haygood Hall in its heyday around 1920. And with that building in the fire perished a vast or an unknown collection of historical documents, but the archives, the papers, the catalogs, the newspapers, the records of Payne College, and with that, with John Wesley Gilbert's life. And that made this project, writing a book about Professor Gilbert, maybe a job for an ancient historian, because my main work is Greece, ancient Greece and Persia. And well, we work with fragments all the time. So it was a task that in an odd way I was drawn to because of the difficult nature of the evidence for Professor Gilbert's life. And in order to go beyond this lost archive, I had to start my research by making connections. And I traveled to Augusta, Georgia, and I worked with the local community and made some really wonderful friends there. And you can see photos of some of them here. Amongst the folks I would particularly mention are Dr. Mallory Millender, who is a Payne College graduate and is also the college's historian. And I first met Dr. Millender online. I was introduced by Reverend Ashley Calhoun. You can see here in the upper right corner. And Reverend Calhoun's father had been the president of Payne College from 1956 to 1970. So it was really with the aid of Dr. Millender and Reverend Calhoun I began to explore this story and to visit Augusta and to learn more about the history of the community, and in that way to get into understanding the life of John Wesley Gilbert. In the center, you can see Ms. Alana Lewis, who's the archivist and librarian of Payne College. And she preserved the documents that had survived the fire and brought in other things during the that had come in after that tragic fire. And so these little bits that she had preserved ended up being very, very important for my story. And then Mr. Rogers and retired Lieutenant Colonel Joyce Law from the Lucy Craft Laney Museum, you can see them as well, and others. Dr. Jimmy Carter, he took me on a 2-hour house by house tour of the historic African-American neighborhoods of Augusta. So this is really a project and a book that grows out of the community itself. And I've said this before, but I'm really just the messenger for a story that belongs to the people of Payne College and to the African-American community of Augusta. So let's move on. And in my research, I brought together little scraps, bits and pieces, things I found through digital searching, through newspapers, fragments of letters he had written, a copy of a newspaper that was found in an attic in Alabama and sent to Payne College. So those of you who like to look around in old trunks and in attics, there's always treasure to be found there. And even some surviving material that hadn't been in Haygood Hall at the time of the fire, like this copy of Gilbert's Lost Congo Diary, a couple of entries that Ashley Calhoun's father, President Calhoun, had copied by hand in 1960. So with the help of the community and with the help of these scattered documents and with digital searching, I was able to reconstruct the story of a man who rose from slavery and from very humble beginnings to become nationally known. And that's kind of the story I wanted to take you through tonight. Not every part of the story, but I'd like to share with you some of the vivid images and some of the places that are involved in Professor Gilbert's life. And one place we might start with is this church, Trinity Christian Methodist Episcopal, or CME Church. You can see it there around 1916, and you can see it on the right in June 2018, when the church was being moved from its original site across the street to a new location because the land on which the church originally sat had been contaminated by the Georgia Power and Light. So they were trying to save this historic church from that chemical contamination. And why is Trinity important? Well, in May of 1871, a little boy who went by the name then of Wesley Gilbert went to fill out a form for his Freedmen's Bank account. This was a bank that was set up during and after the Civil War to help freed slaves and others to build savings. And you can see Wesley's account there. He even signed his name, which is unusual for a boy of his age on these records. And you can see occupation, go to school to Miss Chestnut. And we happen to have Miss Chestnut's Freedmen's Bank record. She's Cecilia Chestnut Harper. And if you see her occupation, school teacher at Trinity. So this is the place that John Wesley Gilbert began his education at the Trinity CME Church. Now, it wasn't the same church that I showed you the picture of. There was an earlier version, an earlier building, but it was the same site where the Trinity CME Church was until it was moved in 2018. And that was where Gilbert began his journey to education. He had been born in slavery in 1863 in rural Georgia. He went to school first at Trinity and then went into public school in Augusta, Georgia. And he puts it very vividly later. He spent half of the year working, doing hard farm labor, and the other half he spent in the public schools of Augusta. And he was fortunate to be in Augusta because Augusta, Georgia, although like everywhere else in Georgia and in the South, had segregated schools. And although the white schools always got more funding, Augusta had a school board that could levy its own taxes. And the school board funded schools for African-American children. And that enabled young Wesley to get the beginnings of a public education. Now, in those days, there was still no high school for African-American students anywhere in Georgia. And so when Gilbert got through the public school course available to him, he turned to schools that were run by Northern Baptists, a school first called the Augusta Institute. You can see a historical account of it here. And that school later moved to Atlanta, where it became Atlanta Baptist Seminary. And in turn, eventually, the school became Morehouse College, which you might know today. It's the alma mater of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and many other illustrious Americans. So Gilbert was one of the first students of the schools, Augusta Institute and Atlanta Baptist Seminary, that would eventually become Morehouse College. And he began here to read Greek and to read Latin and to advance his education in every way he could. And we can actually follow him in the city directory, where we see him listed for the first time as a student there at the Atlanta Baptist Seminary. But he ran out of money. In 1880, he had to return to Augusta because he was out of funds to pay for school. And for the next 3 years, he had a very difficult time. Later, he recalled that he despaired of achieving a liberal education, and he supported himself by working as a school teacher in Hepzibah and in Augusta. And it seemed as if his life would not be able to, his career would not be able to progress any further until he heard about a new school that was in Augusta, Georgia. And that school was Payne Institute, which is today Payne College. Payne was a cooperative foundation of two Methodist churches. The Methodist Episcopal Church South, or MECS, was a white-dominated church that had split off from the rest of the Methodists in 1844 because its leaders wanted to keep holding slaves. They wanted to maintain slavery. The other member of this cooperative venture was the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. Since 1954, the Christian Methodist, or CME Church. And the CME Church consisted of the former members of the MECS who had split off to become an independent denomination after emancipation. They did this in 1869. So it was a cooperative foundation of Black and white Methodists. It had an interracial board of trustees, which was quite remarkable. And it functioned as an interracial endeavor to educate Black students. And so this is where Gilbert was able to go to continue his education. And his teacher and later his lifelong colleague and mentor was George Williams Walker, an MECS minister, really a remarkable man. Walker later recalled that his mother said, you know, it's a great thing you're doing at this Payne Institute, but I wish that some other mother's son were doing it. I mean, can you imagine like telling that to your son? And Walker's fiance said, I'm going to split up with you unless you stop teaching at the school. And Walker instead ended the engagement. So he and Gilbert would form a very close bond, and Walker would help Gilbert be able to study full time. And in 1886, John Wesley Gilbert became one of the first 7 students of this school. You can see his name here in 1886. And note, by the way, that this was a school that had more women graduates in its first class. 4 of the first 7 were women. It was from the beginning a school where women students as well as men were welcomed. Now, from Augusta, Gilbert was able to go to Brown University with the help of a scholarship. And you can see him sitting here on the steps of the chapel of Brown University. He's right there. He was, in fact, the 3rd African-American graduate of Brown University. And if you look at the late 1880s, he was one of only a few dozen African-Americans who graduated from Northern schools during that period. And this degree at Brown helped him to return back to Payne, where he was hired in 1888. And remarkably, Gilbert was hired as the first Black professor of Payne Institute over the objections of a white instructor who threatened to resign if Gilbert were hired, and the trustees proceeded with hiring him, and that white instructor resigned instead. But it was a remarkable moment for 1888 that an interracial board of Black and white trustees would have a consensus to hire a Black professor over the objections of a white Southerner. It shows you something about the remarkable character of Payne College. And while at Brown, John Wesley Gilbert had worked closely with Albert Harkness. And Harkness, nobody knows about him today, but in the late 1800s, he was one of the most famous Greek and Latin professors in the country, and that made him one of the most famous members of US education, because Greek and Latin was still so central to college and university education in those days. And Gilbert read Greek with Professor Harkness. This is actually his textbook. Gilbert's textbook, I know because there are annotations in it, and it survived the fire and is in the Payne archives today. But Harkness, in addition to teaching Gilbert Greek, also told Gilbert about a new school in Athens, in Athens, Greece, that had just been started and that students were being encouraged to attend. And that school was called the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. Founded in 1881. In fact, the American School exists today. It's internationally recognized, and it is really the first United States overseas research institution. And with the help of Albert Harkness, John Gilbert was able to enroll as a Brown graduate student and to get funding to go to Greece. And here's actually a page from the American School's minutes, and it shows his name, John W. Gilbert Brown. 88. If you've got a sharp eye, you'll see 1889-90. He was actually supposed to go that year, but his wife, Ola, was pregnant with their first child. So he delayed a year until 1890. So John Wesley Gilbert would become the first African-American member of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. And that would make him one of the first 50 Americans of any race, any ethnicity, any background to do professional archaeological work in Greece. But Gilbert was not the first Black scholar who would have been welcomed at the American School. In fact, before Gilbert, two others had been welcomed. The first was a brilliant young professor named Wiley Lane from Howard University. And Wiley Lane was actually on his way to Greece in 1885. He had money in the federal budget to support his trip, but he got pneumonia and he tragically died right before leaving. So he never got to go to Greece. A second Black scholar was William Sanders Scarborough, who was really the most famous African-American classic scholar of his day. And actually today, February 16th, is his birthday. He was born in 1852, February 16th, 1852. And Professor Scarborough wanted to go, but he couldn't find the money. In fact, he was invited to go twice, but he did not have any fellowship that would get him to Greece. So Gilbert was really fulfilling the dreams of these two men who had hoped to go, but both were unable to go to Greece. So in 1890, John Wesley Gilbert went to Greece, and he would stay there until the spring of 1891. Now, some of you in the audience may have been to Athens. Here's a nice Google Earth shot of Greece, of Athens today, a city of more than 3 million people. The American schools, sorry, my screen keeps flipping back. There's the American school, there's the Acropolis. But in 1890, when John Wesley Gilbert got to Greece, it was a very different city. Here's a map from 1890 showing a city of about 100,000 people. It was, visitors loved it. They thought fresh and new and nicely laid out and a very pleasant place to be. And if you've been to Athens more recently, those descriptions do not exactly apply to the modern metropolis. And at the very edge of the city, you can see on the eastern edge the American school, right next to the British school at Athens, sitting on what was then the very, very outskirts of the city, next to an old monastery. Here's a picture of the building of the American school. Gilbert would actually live in this building, and the library is in here. And that's what it looked like in 1888 when it was being built. And this is what it looks like the last time I was in Greece. That's almost the exact same spot. You can see the modern city has just swallowed up the beautiful surroundings of the school. It was a very small group that year in 1890. In fact, there were only 4 students and 2 professors, and they kind of reflect the changing nature of the United States at that time. Carlton Brownson was a Yale student. He's kind of the established northeastern elite of the US, but Andrew Fossum was a Norwegian American. He was actually one of the very first Norwegian Americans to get a Ph.D., quite interestingly. And John Pickard came from a farming family in New Hampshire and had studied at Dartmouth. It would be Gilbert and Pickard who would become the closest friends. They would work together in their archaeological project later in the year. Kind of confusingly, the school had two professors. There was, in 1890, there was no American who was worthy of the name of being an archaeologist. So the school had to hire an annual director every year from one of its member colleges. Rufus Richardson came from Dartmouth, and to get the expertise of someone who knew archaeology, they turned to a New Yorker, actually. Charles Waldstein was a German Jewish New Yorker, but he had a position at Cambridge, and he had the job of so-called permanent director. So 4 students and 2 professors, making for some confusion in who was in charge during the year. But most of the first part of the year, Gilbert and his classmates worked with Rufus Richardson. Now, one of the things about my book that I tried to do is to get behind the kind of institutional formal history of the school. And I did that thanks to the relatives of John Pickard who came to Greece with him. The official reports just mention, oh, well, Pickard's Miss Harris and Miss Potter, doesn't even say who they were, came to some of the lectures. But it turns out that John Pickard came to Athens with his wife, Jeannie, his mother-in-law, Caroline. Edith was Jeannie's cousin, and Emma had been a bridesmaid. And during the year, Caroline and Edith wrote dozens of letters home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to their relatives there. And those letters all survived the intervening time between 1890, 91, and now. Once again, the importance of checking up in those old attics for boxes of letters and correspondence. And these letters give us a really inside picture of Gilbert's life at the American school. For example, here is Edith Harris writing in November 1890, describing Thanksgiving. So here's a group of American expatriates living in Athens, Greece, and they get together for an American Thanksgiving. And the Mrs. Kalopothakis that Edith mentions was a Canadian born missionary who was married to the Reverend Kalopothakis, who was a Greek Protestant minister. So these Americans were also connected with a small community of Greek Protestants in the city of Athens. Now I'm going to stop here just to end one slideshow because the file is so big, and I'm going to start up the next one. Okay, so back to Athens. So it's 1890 and you're walking through the city of Athens, and you might see something like this. By the way, the color on this image is not, it's actually, this image was actually produced with original color around 1890. And as you can see, it was not the metropolis that you might know from today. From the observatory, your eye could wander to the temple of Hephaestus, or the Hephaestion, which is the best preserved temple in all of Greece. You can see way in the back, Mount Lykavitos, and the American school at the foot of Mount Lykavitos. And if your eye travels over to the right, you'll see the Areopagus, or Mars Hill, where the Apostle Paul is said to have spoken, and then the Acropolis with its great temple of the Parthenon. And Gilbert's timing in coming to Greece we had very good timing, because archaeology had developed greatly in the years since he got there. You know, the real beginnings of archaeology in Greece had come in the 1860s and 70s as the Acropolis was cleared of remains and stuff was dumped over the sides. But a lot of it was really treasure hunting, as early diggers were looking for the beautiful remains of Greek sculpture. By the way, this medieval tower was knocked down in 1874. So any photograph with that tower, you can date that. You can date the photograph by the presence of the tower. And if the tower is not there, it's post 1874. And by the time Gilbert got to Greece, it was really a period of transition, a transition from that 1860s and 1870s sort of treasure hunting, digging holes, dumping the dirt over the sides, to a much more careful and systematic form of archaeology as we would know it today. And this is the period, of course, that Heinrich Schliemann has been active all throughout this period from the 1870s and the 80s. And you might think of Schliemann as kind of the perfect transitional figure of this time. And he starts off digging a great trench through ancient Troy, looking for the gold of Priam. But by the end of his life, he is become much more careful about the stratigraphy, that is the archaeological layering of the site, much more careful about the pottery and other finds, more careful about the architecture and the remains of buildings that he finds. And I'll talk about how one of the influences on Schliemann in a couple of moments. And during his year in Greece, John Wesley Gilbert probably met Heinrich Schliemann. He probably met Schliemann in October or November 1890, before Schliemann left Greece to have surgery in Germany, and because he had health problems. And John Wesley Gilbert certainly attended Heinrich Schliemann's funeral, because Schliemann died on the way back from Germany, and his funeral was held in Athens in early January of 1891. And all the members of the American school, including Gilbert, attended that funeral. And you can see some other famous figures of this kind of transitional era. Osman Hamdi Bey, a noted Ottoman archaeologist. And there's Charles Waldstein, our permanent director of the American school. So Gilbert was really in Greece at a time when the old style of excavation was giving way to a much more systematic and careful, you might say scientific style. And one of the things that Gilbert had to contend with was that Waldstein himself was also sort of a transitional figure. Waldstein he recognized the value of careful excavation, but in terms of his personal interests, he was still fascinated with the pretty stuff. He wanted sculpture, he wanted painted vases, he wanted gold jewelry. That was what got his eye, and the kind of slow and painstaking study of an ancient site, he was not as interested in that kind of work. But the scientific archaeology I mentioned was well underway in Athens. In particular, when Gilbert got to Greece, the Parthenon and the Acropolis had just been excavated down to the bedrock. And so Gilbert was able to see these classical remains in about as well preserved as a form as they would have until Greek archaeologists began to do restorations on them about a decade later, in the process inflicting some serious damage. Some of these early restoration attempts use iron clamps and cement that actually damage the marble. And if you have been to Athens more recently, a lot of the restoration being done now is to correct those early restorations. But John Wesley Gilbert walked up the Acropolis, saw this entire area just after it had been fully excavated for the first time. And in fact, that's what Gilbert spent his year in Greece doing, was walking around and looking at stuff. And his professor, Rufus Richardson, has a great phrase in a letter home: we aim to leave no stone unturned unless it was too big to allow it. So that's what they did, was walk through Athens looking for the remains of antiquities. And they often carried along with them the Greek text of an author, Pausanias, who was Pausanias was a Roman period tourist. He had visited Greece during the Roman Empire and written a description. And so scholars called themselves Pausaniacs because they were busy trying to match what Pausanias said with the remains on the ground. And this text, Mythology and Monuments of Ancient Athens, is one that the Americans actually joke about having with them. It was written by Jane Harrison, who was a very, very famous British classical scholar. And Gilbert also heard lectures from the head of the German Institute, a scholar named Wilhelm Dörpfeld, who's sometimes called Schliemann's greatest find, because it was Dörpfeld who helped Schliemann to appreciate the careful study of architecture and of stratigraphy. And of course, Dörpfeld spoke in German, so that John Wesley Gilbert listened to Dörpfeld's lectures, sometimes 4 hours at a time, speaking on site. And he got the latest in archaeological evidence that Dörpfeld had to offer. And so one particular place that the Americans were looking for is quite interesting because it hadn't been excavated yet, and that was the Agora, the civic center or the marketplace. And I actually should go back to the map there for a second, and you'll see that this area here is not labeled as the Agora, but a place called the Stoa of the Giants is, and that is this picture you're looking at there. And this is as Gilbert would have seen it, because the bicyclist in the foreground is an American college student, actually from Washington University in St. Louis, who was biking through Greece and then on his way to bike around the world and actually met Gilbert. And this photograph shows the area just as Gilbert would have seen it. And it is very interesting to look at this spot because starting in the 1930s, the American School of Classical Studies began to excavate the Agora, and that photo you just saw was taken just about here. So if you go to Athens today, you will see the Civic Center and Marketplace completely excavated, not buried under remains and modern housing the way that Gilbert saw it. And they also went outside of Athens, and you would be amazed by how much walking they did. Here's the walk they did through Attica, which is the territory of Athens, in October of 1890, 15 miles the first day. And the highlight of that was seeing the burial mound of Marathon from the famous Battle of Marathon. It's between 23 and 28 miles the second day, all the way through these hills. A highlight of that was seeing the temples of the ancient site of Rhamnus, which had just been excavated. And then on the third day, about 25 miles, making it all the way back. And I can actually reconstruct this trek because Andrew Fossum, one of the other students, actually left behind a record of their trip. And we don't have time to talk about the archaeological material that Gilbert saw here, but I just want to show you one spot, which is the burial mound of the Athenians. And you can see it here in this photograph was taken about 1897 or 1898. For a long time, people had looked at this mound and said, oh, it's just a prehistoric burial mound. Even Heinrich Schliemann had dug into it in the 1880s and he said, there's nothing here that's of interest. It's got some prehistoric stuff. But in the spring of 1890, a Greek archaeologist named Valerios Stais had excavated again and using scientific techniques. And he had found pottery and the remains of bones that could be dated, the pottery at least could be dated around the time of the Battle of Marathon. And a commission came out to examine the remains, an international group of archaeologists, and they agreed that this in fact is the burial mound of the Athenians. So John Wesley Gilbert was one of the first scholars to visit this site after it was identified as the burial mound of the Athenians who fell in the famous Battle of Marathon. For you archaeologists listening, of course, there is a more recent controversy about whether this actually is the mound, but that's how scholars are. We always have to revisit old conclusions. Now, in Greece, it normally does not snow in the winter, but the winter of 1890 and 91 was extremely cold, and it snowed several times in Athens. And so the American schoolers spent the winter in the library of the American school. And you can see it here around 1900. And one way you can date it actually is you see the electric lights. Those are installed around 1900. And this is where Gilbert sat, maybe not this exact seat, but certainly in a place very much like this. That's Rufus Richardson, his professor. And that is Professor Richardson's wife, Alice Lyndon Bowen Richardson, who came from a very, very prominent American family. And I show this partly because keep an eye on, see the doors here and the bookshelves and the fireplace. Well, that is today the main reading room of the American School Library. Same doors, same bookshelves, same fireplace. And here where my Greek colleague is sitting, when I was a student at the American School in 1996, to 1997, I sat there at that spot. And I wrote my first scholarly article there at that spot. And this was one of the things that got me interested in Professor Gilbert's life, that I had walked in his footsteps before I even knew who he was. And that I had visited many of the same sites that he did. And he had been there before me. And I felt like I was retracing the steps of one of my predecessors, someone who had set an example for all of us who now sit in this reading room in the school library. And in that library, John Wesley Gilbert wrote a thesis. And we don't actually have the thesis. It was lost somewhere along the way, but we have a mention of it from William Sanders Scarborough, who I told you about earlier, but wanted to go to Greece. In January of 1891, Gilbert actually wrote to Scarborough saying, hey, I made it to the American school, and here's what I'm doing. I read a thesis. And Scarborough was very, very influenced by this. He mentioned it in a publication where he described the letter that he has, and he even gives the title of Gilbert's thesis, The Demes of Athens. And the demes are the neighborhoods or districts of classical Athens. And even many years later, Scarborough in his autobiography mentions, he actually quotes a line from Gilbert's letter. So Scarborough was, I think, very touched that Gilbert, who had never met at this time, would write him a letter, and it was as if he had fulfilled the dream that Scarborough had of going to Athens, Greece. So as I said, we don't have Gilbert's thesis, but we do know that he was the first American to write about the demes, the neighborhoods or districts of classical Athens. This is a very important topic for understanding how ancient Athenian democracy worked. And we do know that this thesis helped Gilbert to earn his MA degree from Brown University. And that would make him the first African-American to win an MA from Brown University, and actually one of the first African-Americans to have an advanced degree in classical studies from anywhere in the United States. So maybe someday we'll find the thesis either in a box in Athens, or maybe there was another handwritten copy that made its way back to the United States. We've only got about 10 minutes left, so I want to talk about Gilbert's archaeological work at Eretria, and then give you a little bit of discussion of his later career, including that California connection that I promised Kevin. In February and March 1891, the American school went to work at the ancient site of Eretria, which is on the island of Euboea or Evia, north of Athens. So that's the mainland you can see up there. Athens itself is down that way, and here is Eretria on the island of Euboea. And the particular thing that Gilbert would work on, you can see right up at the top. It hasn't changed much. It's the fortification wall of ancient Eretria. You can see it there. But in 1891, Eretria was a tiny village of maybe about 400 people. And it wasn't the larger town that you see here. So the work that Gilbert would do was very important because it preserved material that's been lost or covered over in the years since he was there. They all live together. Here's that tiny village. Here I'm able to get all sorts of little details from Charles Waldstein's diary. His terrible handwriting, but he gives such striking bits of information about living in this village. We're all tired, played cards together in our little house with beds for 6 in 2 rooms. A tent would be better. I mentioned how cold it was. You can see the snow on the out there on the mountains of Euboea. And Waldstein was really interested, as I mentioned, in pretty stuff. So he spent a lot of time going back and forth to different parts of the site, looking for excavating, looking for tombs, and in particular a tomb that had some very wealthy finds in its multiple graves. You can see the quotation from his diary there. It was exciting to see gold appear. And he found an inscription here that partly read, had a woman's name, Boete, the daughter of Aristotle. And he conjectured that therefore someone else in this tomb must be the Aristotle. And he said, we found the tomb of Aristotle, which was totally false. This is not the tomb of Aristotle. This tomb dates to at least probably 100 years after Aristotle's death. And so the archaeology the Americans were doing was not very advanced. They were hacking away looking for gold, except when it came to what Gilbert was doing with his partner, John Picard. And he describes it as the tracing and measuring of city walls, noting the towers, mapping everything of significance. If you stand at this spot today, all these stones are gone. But Gilbert, you can see here, and Picard here, and their Greek assistant were able to carefully map and record all of these remains. And they produced an archaeological and topographical survey, which was the most advanced that any American team had produced so far in American work in Greece. It really set the standard for things that would come afterward. And if you talk to the Swiss and Greek archaeologists who work at Eretria today, they'll tell you that Picard and Gilbert's survey remains of great value because of the careful mapping that they did and the recording of things that have since been lost. And speaking of things that have been lost, one of the things that you will find in my book is this picture showing Gilbert and Picard. Oops, I'll go back. Showing Gilbert and Picard undertaking their survey work. This photograph was taken in March of 1891, and then it was lost, and it was rediscovered in May of 2021 when I was doing the illustrations for my book. And I asked Natalia Vogaikov-Brogan, the archivist of the American School, Natalia, do you have any good landscape pictures of Athens around 1890? And she came back a week later and she said, well, I don't have any of those pictures, but I did find this picture that's been lost for 130 years. And it's a very striking picture that shows the two men working together. And you can see the now lost blocks of the ancient city walls right in front of them. And this is one of the things I was able to include in my book. Now, I've focused this evening really on talking about Gilbert's archaeological work. I think partly given the interests of historic preservation that your group has, but my book actually goes on to cover the entirety of Gilbert's life. His life as a professor at Payne College, as a community leader in Augusta, as a church leader. He eventually played a leading role in the CME church and in other aspects of his life. And you can see him here. He's actually at the tomb of John Wesley, his namesake. That's Wesley's tomb in London. There is Professor Gilbert. And among the other leaders of the CME church you see here is C.H. Phillips. And C.H. Phillips is our California connection because if you know anything about the history of Santa Monica, there is a Phillips Chapel CME church in Santa Monica, California. And that was founded by C.H. Phillips in 1908. And there's actually a CME church here in Santa Barbara, California that I need to do more work on. Actually, if anybody in the audience is associated with that church or knows people with the church, Ann Peterson has graciously given me some contact information, but it's on my list of things to do is make contact and build that California connection. Now, as we close off, I've got about 5 minutes left, and I'd be happy to talk a bit more if you have questions. It would be enough to be recognized as the first Black archaeologist, or really as the Society of Black Archaeologists called Gilbert, the first professionally trained archaeologist of African descent. Is the first professionally trained American archaeologist of African descent is the terms that the Society of Black Archaeologists has used. But Gilbert had an entirely additional journey, an odyssey in 1911, 1912, when he embarked on an interracial mission in company with Bishop Walter Russell Lambeth of the MECS, remember that white Methodist denomination, to establish a Methodist mission in the Belgian Congo. And the two men walked and went by river more than 1,000 miles, and they were able to establish a connection with the local leader at a place called Wembo Nyama. And that mission still exists in some form up until today. So this is also a story, and another incredible story that I examine in the book, but you'll have to read the book to get the whole story. So let me just close off by saying, his life is an incredible story of an individual, moving from humble beginnings and facing the racism, the violence, the segregation, the Jim Crow apartheid that developed in the early 20th century in the United States. But his story is also a story of a community. In his work at Payne College over the generations, Gilbert educated young men and women who would go on to make their marks in many different parts of the country. And Payne College itself is one of a whole constellation of historically Black colleges and universities that achieved really remarkable, impressive, inspiring educational results despite all of the obstacles that African Americans faced in achieving education. So when we think about Gilbert's life, we can both appreciate him as an individual, but also appreciate him as part of this wider story of African American achievement despite the greatest odds. So with that, I'll just end with this picture of Gilbert Lambeth Chapel at Payne College. And I hope that you've enjoyed the presentation. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Leo. That was fascinating to learn more about Gilbert's life. I think I'll lead off with a question, and I think we have a couple came through. If you have questions out there, you can either use the chat box, or you can use our Q&A function that look at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask a question. We'll try to get to as many as we can. My first question, you just talked about or mentioned the obstacles that African Americans would have experienced in these, even just these scholarly pursuits, but also throughout his life. Did you come across in your research any what we would call specific examples of what we would call today microaggressions or even blatant discrimination in either his scholarly pursuits or his later life? You're on mute, sorry.
There was no need to be micro. I mean, the racism in the world that Gilbert was born into and grew up in was overt. It was constant. It was sanctioned by the government, and so Gilbert had to contend all his life with formal segregation, with the cultural effects of Jim Crow, with the threat of violence, and that's a constant backdrop to his life. And against that, I would place again his focus on interracial cooperation, and that is evident in his early work at Atlanta Baptist, Payne College, I mentioned, and his work also in Athens, Greece. So it's very sobering I grew up in Hawaii. I did not learn much of this history as a young person because we were focused on the history of Asia. And for me to learn the 19th and 20th century United States history was a very sobering experience to see what he had to contend with. And I think that makes his work and the work of his contemporaries all the more impressive and admirable that they were able to achieve in the face of such challenges.
Thank you. One of our team members, our visitor experience staff member, Claire, asks a good question. Were there any burning questions that you wish you could get the answer to, but through your research you weren't able to find out? I know you talked about not having a copy of the thesis, which is a huge thing, because that would have been, such a find. But was there any questions that you wish you could answer that you couldn't?
I think number one is the number one is the thesis, because we have the title. We know that it was commended by the two directors, by Richardson and Waldstein. And I would like to know what happened. One possibility is that the person who ran the publications for the American School died suddenly. And it might have been that the paper was there. And of course, this is the day before, he probably hand wrote it. It was a day before you could easily make copies, and there was maybe one or maybe two copies. And so that is one of the biggest questions to me. I would also, writing a biography, you hope for more texture about a person's daily. I mean, this is like the first biography it is the first biography I've written. So when one reads a biography, you hope for more texture of daily life. And because we don't have much of his writing, that was a challenge, but I succeeded by kind of building the networks around him. So people who were in his group, members of his church, members at the schools that he was working at, even other members of the African-American educational community in the South, I was able to kind of build up a picture of his life, even without those internal documents. And as to what if I were to continue researching, I think I would build on that to try to put him more into place in his local community in terms of the historical monuments. And you have the Santa Barbara Trust. Augusta has a number of groups, Historic Augusta, the African American Historical Society, that are doing this. And I've been continuing to work with those folks that I mentioned early on to try to do more to place Gilbert into that physical world.
Great, thank you. We have a good question from Bessie in the audience, asking about if you could talk about representation in the field today, and specifically at the American School, African Americans attending there today, or maybe when you were there. What's maybe the how many African Americans are represented in this?
That's a good question. I don't have statistics. I don't know about this year in particular, but since the mid 20th century, there have been more and more, not just African American, but students of a variety of different heritages and backgrounds. It's important to recognize that, you know, Gilbert went in 1890, but no students followed him immediately afterward. And one reason that is the school he went back to teach at Payne College didn't have an archaeology department. He didn't have money for lantern slides or maps or all the teaching aids he needed. And people didn't have money to go to Greece. So in another situation, for example, if Wiley Lane had gone to Greece, he would have come back to Howard University, which was federally funded. And therefore, there would have been more opportunity for Black students to go to Greece sooner than the mid 20th century. Another important factor we have to consider is that by the early 1900s, African American educational leaders were turning away from classics as a discipline, and people such as W.E.B. Du Bois, who I think everyone in the audience has heard of, and John Hope, who you may not have heard of. John Hope was a student of Gilbert's. He was later the first Black president of Atlanta University and Morehouse College. Both Du Bois and John Hope would later say, you know, we need less Greek and Latin, less classics. We need more history, more social sciences, more mathematics, more sociology. And so we can't neglect the agency of Black educational leaders who were looking to go in other directions. The American School has now actually established a fellowship named in honor of Professor Scarborough, because Professor Scarborough couldn't go. So, you know, there's a commitment to increasing the access to the school. But there's a combination of things to consider. To Bessie's question is, you know, it's both finances and where Gilbert went back to teach, and also the choices that Black educational leaders were making, and the changing position of classical studies in the US.
Great, thank you. I thought that was a good question. And then our staff archaeologist, Michael Mwale, has a good question about more focused around his, if you know of any of his archaeological observations or finds in his missionary journey through Africa. Did he do archaeology while he was in Africa? And then I think a follow-up question from another audience member is asking about when around that time, what was happening in Africa. There's a lot going on, you know, with imperialism, the Belgium aggressions in the Congo. Did you find any evidence of his views of any of those things happening?
And is this all the question about archaeological observations? Is that rolled up in there as well?
Yeah, that's the first question. Sorry, it was about Africa.
Okay, so to talk about Gilbert's work in Africa, which is, I mean, I didn't expect, you know, I mentioned my American School connection, and I didn't expect to do as much work on the Congo as I did for the book. But I was able to meet, actually through Reverend Calhoun, I met an American who had grown up at the Wembo Nyama mission because his parents were missionaries. He spoke the language Otatela fluently, and a Congolese professor who had retired in the US. And so these two men, Professor Dimanja and Reverend Lavelle, gave me a kind of a firsthand view of what the mission was like in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and up into the 60s when they both left. So Gilbert does not make any archaeological observations, but he apparently did bring back a number of artifacts with him. And they were at Payne College, and they were badly damaged during the 1968 fire, but they're still there. I mentioned Ms. Lewis, and she has them preserved as far as she can, and I think they're awaiting restoration and study. And one thing I would like to do actually is to see what those items might have been. And if we had Gilbert's diary from the Congo, we might know more. But President Calhoun, when he was writing his book, a book on Gilbert and Lambeth, borrowed the diary from Gilbert's surviving daughter. Then he returned the diary to her in New York City. And the daughter, Alma Gilbert Sims, died in New York in 1980. And I tried to find some connection, but I couldn't find anybody. No grandchildren, no relatives. We looked for the CME church congregations. So that was another thing that's my second on my list after the thesis is the Congo. the Congo Diary. Teague asks, how many languages did he speak? He read classical Greek and Latin, Teague. He also spoke modern Greek very well. He spoke French very well. He wrote French well. I mentioned German that he studied, and I'm going to type the two languages the two African languages, Otetela and Chiluba, because the people may be less familiar with those. Chiluba and Otetela are languages spoken in the Congo, and Gilbert studied those before his departure so that he would be able to talk to people when he was in Africa. And he also took a class in biblical Hebrew. So, I mean, he was really a remarkable linguist, and he threw himself into languages, I think partly because he liked to he liked to talk to people. He was a very personable man.
There's another question from Teague there.
Oh, okay. There's let's see. I'll just go to the last of, boy, Teague, the question about Howard and that's a question, that's a conversation, not a question. It's a really good question though. What is the, historically Black colleges and universities, classics historically was central to Black education. And both Professor Gilbert, I mentioned Wiley Lane, William Sanders Scarborough. There's a very illustrious history there, but there's a conversation that people are having these days. I want to go back to Teague's archaeological question about the fortifications. So the ancient Eritrea was a very powerful and well-known trading city, and it had merchants going around around the Aegean, but it also allied with Athens to support a revolt against the Persian Empire. And so I mentioned the Battle of Marathon. The Persians stopped at Eritrea and they burnt it down in 490 BC on their way to Marathon. So those walls, the walls that you see, some of them were built at that time, and I think they were meant to protect against invaders like the Persians.
You're bringing me back to my ancient Greece course in undergrad that I remember taking. Yes, I think those are most of the questions. Is there one thing that you would you really summed it all up at the end there about why his life matters to you? Why? One question that I think is maybe a good final question is, when did it's such an endeavor to go from having an interest to starting to collect more information and doing all this research, but then when did you know that you had enough for a book? That's always interesting to me. How do you know you have enough for a whole book?
I thought I would write an article, and I mentioned again that I was, my main field is ancient Greece and ancient Persia. In fact, I just came, an hour before I was teaching Greek history with 5th century to undergraduates. So I thought I'd write an article, and it was just a topic that I didn't know about, and it drew me in. And I began to look for more. And I thought I wouldn't have much, but I have really good colleagues. And in particular, my emerita colleague, Patricia Klein-Cohen, who was a historian of the 19th century United States. Some of you might know her. She became, I like to say, like a second PhD advisor, because she kept saying, there's more. You could look here and you could look here. And she taught me how to look at archives, to look at things like slave owners' records, where I could trace Gilbert's ancestors, to look at newspaper databases where I could find Gilbert's own publications. And I think it was really working with Pat that showed me how much there was sort of in the network around Gilbert. And I realized that I had a book. I mean, that was 2015 I started. I think I went full-time on this by 2016. Of course, I had 2 kids during that time, and then the pandemic came. So it was sometime in there that I decided I just had to, that I had to write this. And maybe a place to end is that, I was fortunate in my timing. I finished the research I needed to do in person at the end of 2019. And of course, I didn't know what would happen in 2020. And then by the time I needed to do more on the Congo, archives had reopened in late 2020, early 2021, especially in Tennessee, in Mississippi, and Georgia. I was able to draw on on archives there. And many scholars, are still struggling with that challenge. But if I was 6 months later, this book would not be out. So it's also a story about the timing that it takes to figure out the timing it takes. My timing was good, I think, is the best thing to say. And I just was very fortunate in that respect.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much for your time and sharing your research with us. And I know a lot of people probably have the question of where they can get a copy of this book. So is there a good place for them? I know Oxford University Press, maybe their website, or is it on Amazon and other locations?
It is. Of course, I would suggest you patronize your local bookstore, Chaucer's, or if you order online, there are Black-owned bookstores online that you could, local bookstores that you could patronize. Amazon also, certainly. And I would mention that, you know, academic books don't sell a lot, but I plan to donate any royalties that come to Payne and also to the Scarborough Fellowship. So if you want to support the Payne and the Scarborough Fellowship, please do buy a copy. And of course, your local library, such as Goleta Valley Public Library and UCSB Library, should also have a copy.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to put a link in the chat for everyone. We are going to be posting this on our lectures webpage and on our YouTube channel in about probably a week. We have to edit the video and we'll get it up there. You can go to www.sbthp.org/lectures to see all the other Zoom webinar lectures we've done throughout the pandemic and will continue to do into the future. As we're more able to meet in person now, we're still going to be doing these online lectures because we're able to reach so many more people. And I know people are used to Zoom now, so we're going to keep doing these. So thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for taking the time to be here.